The gavel slammed down like thunder. The sound cut through the courtroom, sharp, final, cruel. Amara flinched. The wooden floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble as the echoes faded into whispers. She could feel every stare like a needle on her skin. The judge, an old white man with grey hair slicked back and a face carved in arrogance, leaned forward. His eyes glistened with the same polished shine as the wood around him. "You people," he said, his voice soaked in disdain, "always find a way to play the victim." The words floated heavy in the air, slow and deliberate, meant to wound. Behind him, the flag hung stiff and proud, but to Amara, it looked like a curtain that hid justice instead of showing it. The gallery chuckled, a low, cruel laughter. It came from the kind of people who wore judgment like perfume, sweet for themselves, poisonous for everyone else. Amara's eyes dropped to the floor, her fingers tightening around her apron. The soft cotton had become her anchor. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not from guilt, but from fear of what always came next when people like her stood before people like him. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to scream that she wasn't a thief. But when she opened her mouth, her voice cracked before it even reached her lips. She looked down at her hands, brown, rough, lined with years of scrubbing, polishing, washing. Hands that raised other people's children, served other people's dinners, cleaned other people's mess. And yet here she was, treated like the dirt she'd spent her life cleaning. "Miss Amara, answer the question," the judge barked, cutting through her silence. "Did you or did you not steal the bracelet?" She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time. "No, sir," she whispered, the words trembling but true. The judge leaned back, lips curling. "No, sir," he mocked, dragging out the words, mimicking her accent. The gallery laughed again. Amara's throat tightened. Every chuckle felt like a stone being thrown. "You people," he said again, shaking his head. "Always excuses, always tears, always the same story." He slammed the gavel once more, just to remind her who held the power. Her employer, Mrs. Whitmore, sat in the front row, dressed in white silk and crocodile tears. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue she didn't need. "It's such a shame," she said softly, loud enough for the court to hear. "We trusted her." Amara's stomach twisted. She remembered that bracelet, gold, cold, resting on the dressing table while she dusted the mirror. She had seen it. She had left it there. And days later, it was gone. They said they found it in her room. But Amara knew what they didn't say, that Mrs. Whitmore's son had been in that same room, hiding from a mother who loved appearances more than truth. Still, the judge wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in theater, and Amara was his villain. "You see, Miss Amara," he said, leaning forward, "this is what happens when people forget their place." His words sliced through the silence. "Your place," he repeated, "is to serve, not to steal, not to talk back, serve." Something inside her snapped, not loud, not visible, but deep. It was the kind of break that changes the shape of a soul. She wanted to scream that she had done nothing wrong, that she had given her life to families like theirs, only to be thrown away the moment she stopped smiling. But the words refused to come. Her tongue felt heavy, her pride felt heavier. Judge sighed, tapping the gavel against his desk, pretending to think. "I could sentence you today," he said, almost playfully, "but I'll give you one last chance to apologize to Mrs. Whitmore." The room grew still. All eyes turned to her. Mrs. Whitmore tilted her head, waiting. Amara looked at her, really looked at her, the perfect hair, the pearls, the soft smile that wasn't soft at all. Every second stretched. Her lips parted. But before she could speak, the doors behind her groaned open. A cold draft swept through the room. Heads turned. The chatter died. The echo of polished shoes clicked against the marble floor. A man stepped in. Tall, broad shoulders, skin dark as thunderclouds before rain. His suit, deep navy, fit like authority itself. The judge frowned, annoyed at the interruption. "Court is in session," he snapped. The man didn't stop walking. His eyes locked on Amara. Something in his gaze made her heart skip, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He reached the center of the aisle. The whispers began. "Who is that? Is he press? Is he police?" The judge lifted his chin, ready to scold. But then the man spoke. Calm, steady, powerful. "Your Honor," he said, his voice rolling like thunder through the silence, "before you continue this mockery," he paused, eyes narrowing, "I'm her lawyer and her father." Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Whitmore's tissue froze Medea. The judge blinked, confused, his gavel suspended halfway. Amara felt her knees weaken. Her father. She hadn't seen him in over 15 years. The last time she did, he was a construction worker with cracked boots and dreams too heavy to carry. And now he stood before her in a tailored suit, his voice commanding a room that had been built to silence people like them. The judge's smirk faltered. "Excuse me," he said, his tone trembling for the first time. The man stepped closer, placing his briefcase gently on the table. "You heard me," he said, his voice steady. "You've mocked her, humiliated her, and denied her the right to defend herself, but that ends today." The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the old ceiling fan. Amara's breath hitched. Her father's hand brushed her shoulder, firm, reassuring, real. For the first time in weeks, she felt the ground steady beneath her. The judge tried to recover his authority. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, straightening in his chair. "This case was already rigged," her father interrupted. "Already decided before she even walked in here. Isn't that right?" His words cut sharper than any gavel. The judge's face reddened. "You're out of order," he barked. Her father leaned in. "No, Your Honor," he said softly. "For the first time in this courtroom, order has just arrived." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Amara's eyes welled with tears she didn't want to shed, not of shame, of something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. The kind of pride that makes your back straighten, your chin lift, your spirit remember who it is. She turned toward her father. He nodded just once. A silent promise: "You're not alone anymore." The judge lowered his gavel slowly, his smirk gone. The air felt different now, heavier, uncertain. Power had shifted. For the first time that morning, Amara didn't feel small. The courtroom that once swallowed her whole now seemed to shrink around her. Her father stood tall beside her, his presence filling the space that humiliation had once occupied. The gavel didn't fall again that day. It just hovered there, trembling in the judge's hand, like even justice was afraid of what might happen next. And in that moment, Amara lifted her chin. The silence in the courtroom was sharp enough to cut through bone. The same judge who'd mocked Amara minutes ago now stumbled over his own words. His gavel hung in Medea, useless. "Sir, this is highly irregular," he stammered, but the man standing before him didn't need to raise his voice to silence a room. "Irregular," he said slowly, his tone calm but razor-edged, "is watching my daughter humiliated in a court that calls itself just." The echo of his words filled every corner, crawling under the skin of everyone who had laughed before. The name David Okoro began to ripple through the crowd like a warning. Some recognized it instantly: the Harvard-educated civil rights attorney who had turned courtrooms into battlegrounds and corruption into casualties. Others just felt it, that sudden shift in energy when power changes hands. The judge adjusted his glasses, his authority crumbling like old plaster. "Mr. Okoro, you can't just walk in here and grandstand," he said, voice trembling behind his anger, but David didn't flinch. He took a step forward, slow and measured, like every movement was part of something deliberate. His voice dropped lower, steady as a heartbeat. "Then let's proceed," he said. "Let's talk about evidence. Let's talk about bias." A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. The same people who had smirked at Amara now leaned forward, curiosity beginning to replace contempt. The bailiff, unsure of whether to intervene, looked toward the judge for direction, but the judge said nothing. He just sat there, the lines around his mouth tightening. David opened his briefcase with calm precision. The sound of the latch clicking open echoed through the room like a challenge. He placed 3 documents on the table. "These," he said, "are security reports from the Whitmore estate. You'll notice something interesting. The footage from the day of the alleged theft is missing. Gone, vanished, just like the truth." The judge frowned. "That's circumstantial," he said quickly, his confidence returning in fragments. David nodded. "You're right," he said, "but let's add this." He pulled out another folder, this one stamped with the logo of a private investigation firm. An independent technician confirmed that only one segment of footage was deleted, the exact 2 hours during which Mrs. Whitmore claims the theft occurred. Convenient, isn't it? The gallery stirred again. Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her lawyer whispering in her ear. Amara watched, her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. She wanted to breathe, but fear and hope were wrestling inside her chest. David wasn't done, his tone sharpened. Now about the witnesses, he continued. Every single one works for the Whitmore family, the gardener, the driver, the maid, the same people whose paychecks depend on keeping Mrs. Whitmore happy. He looked directly at the judge. And yet not one independent witness was called, not one. The judge opened his mouth, but David didn't let him speak. Tell me, Your Honor, is that justice or just theater? The question hung in the air like smoke. The judge's smirk returned, thinner now, stretched tight over discomfort. Are you accusing this court of misconduct, Mr. Okoro? He asked, forcing his voice steady. David didn't blink. No, he said quietly. I'm accusing this system, the one you represent, of treating dignity like a privilege instead of a right. The words landed hard. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate before ticking again. For the first time since the trial began, the laughter was gone. No one dared to move. Even Mrs. Whitmore's polished confidence began to crack. She adjusted her pearls, eyes darting toward the exits. Amara sat still, her heart pounding, watching her father dismantle every lie that had trapped her. The rhythm of his voice was like music, deliberate, powerful, unbroken. Every word was a hammer breaking down a wall she'd spent years believing could never fall. The judge shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. Mr. Okoro, he said, your accusations are serious. You're treading on dangerous ground. David smiled faintly. I've walked this ground my whole life, he said, and every time the earth shakes a little more. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the judge. You see, Your Honor, when a poor black woman is accused, the system moves fast. Evidence disappears, voices vanish. But when the truth points back to the powerful, suddenly we need more time, more proof, more excuses. A heavy silence followed. The words had weight, the kind that couldn't be ignored, even by those who wanted to. The judge tried to regain control, his voice rising. Order, he shouted, slamming the gavel once. The sound didn't carry the same authority it had before. It sounded small now, weak. David waited for the noise to settle. Then, in a softer voice, he said, Order begins with honesty, Your Honor, not with silence. Amara's eyes glistened. For the first time in weeks, she felt the fog of shame begin to lift. She glanced around the courtroom at the faces that once sneered at her and saw something different now. Curiosity, guilt, maybe even respect. Her father turned toward her for a brief moment, his expression unreadable but full of unspoken strength. He had come back not just to defend her name, but to remind everyone, including her, that she was worth defending. The judge leaned back, visibly shaken. His voice softened, though the arrogance still lingered. You've made your point, Mr. Okoro, he said, but this isn't over. The law doesn't bend for emotion. David straightened his tie. It doesn't bend, he said. It breaks when truth pushes hard enough. A few people in the gallery clapped before catching themselves. The judge shot them a glare and silence returned, but the mood had changed. The balance of power had shifted. David gathered his papers slowly, deliberately. We'll reconvene tomorrow, the judge said quickly, trying to sound in control. This hearing is adjourned. He slammed the gavel down, but even that sound, once so final, now felt hollow. As the courtroom began to empty, Amara stayed seated. She couldn't move. The world around her seemed to blur, the footsteps, the whispers, the faint rustle of papers. She looked up at her father, her voice barely a whisper. You came back, she said. He nodded. I never stopped watching, he replied. Just waited for the right moment to remind them who you are. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to cry, but words felt too small. Instead, she just stood beside him, letting his presence speak for both of them. The marble floor beneath their feet felt steadier now, like the ground had remembered its purpose. As they walked toward the exit, the judge sat frozen on his bench, staring down at his papers. The last thing he heard before the doors closed was David's voice, low, calm, and certain. We're not done, Your Honor, not until this court remembers what justice looks like. And as the doors swung shut, Amara looked back one last time. The room that had once humiliated her now seemed smaller, weaker, less certain. But deep inside, she knew men like that judge never surrendered easily. Somewhere behind that smirk and those cold eyes, revenge was already forming. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy as the morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows over polished wood and stiff collars. The judge entered, his steps heavy and deliberate, carrying with him a cloud of bitterness that seemed to settle over the room like thick fog. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, ready to strike again with the venom he'd saved overnight. Before anyone could speak, he fixed his gaze on David Okoro and spat, "Mr. Okoro, you're turning this courtroom into a racial circus." The words dropped like stones, cold and sharp. The gallery shifted uncomfortably, some faces tightening with tension, others leaning forward, hungry for what would come next. David's response was slow, measured, a smile not of arrogance, but of quiet patience, like a river eroding a stubborn rock. "No, Your Honor," he said gently but firmly. "The circus began when truth stopped being welcome in this room." The judge's eyes flickered with a flash of annoyance, but he said nothing more. The weight of those words hung in the air, pressing on the walls of a courtroom built to crush the powerless. David turned, his voice now steady and resolute. "I have one last witness." The door opened quietly, and a woman entered, small, fragile, worn by years of service, yet carrying herself with a dignity that no one could take away. She was the housekeeper of the Whitmore mansion. Her hands trembled as she approached the stand, but her eyes held a fire that told a different story. She cleared her throat, the room falling silent in anticipation. "I saw Mrs. Whitmore hide the necklace," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "She said she wanted to teach the maid a lesson." The words landed like thunder. A gasp ran through the gallery. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled furiously. The judge's face paled, his gavel slamming down hard in a desperate attempt to restore order. But the sound was hollow, empty, the fragile mask of his authority cracking wide open. The jurors exchanged glances, the weight of truth settling on their shoulders like a sudden storm. The carefully constructed lies began to crumble, exposed by the light of one quiet woman's courage. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She sat rigid, unable to speak but burning with a fierce sense of vindication. She watched as the courtroom shifted beneath her. The very space that had once mocked and dismissed her was now trembling, uncertain, forced to reckon with a truth that no power could silence. David turned to her, eyes soft but fierce. "You held your head high when they tried to break you," he said, voice full of pride. "That's what real strength looks like." The words settled between them, a silent bond forged in the fires of injustice and resilience. The courtroom, once a place of humiliation, now held a sacred stillness. The spectators, the jurors, even the judge, all caught in a moment of silent awe. The scales of power had shifted. Where once stood a woman crushed by accusation, now stood a symbol of quiet dignity and unwavering strength. The judge, his face pale and lips parted as if searching for words, had nothing left to say. Justice had found its voice that day, not in thunderous proclamations or grand gestures, but through the soft, steady courage of a maid who refused to be broken. And as the courtroom emptied, the lesson was clear. Dignity is not given by courts or crowns. It lives in the courage to stand, to speak, and to be seen for who you truly are. The fight was far from over, but for that moment, victory belonged to truth, and through it, to Amara. The gavel came down with a heavy finality, but not on Amara. It fell on the web of lies that had tried to chain her, to silence her, to erase her very existence. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sharp and clear, breaking the thick tension that had held the room hostage for weeks. "Case dismissed," the judge muttered, voice low, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. His eyes, once sharp and smug, now avoided hers, refusing to meet the woman whose dignity he had tried so hard to crush. In that moment, the scales of justice, though battered and slow, finally tipped in favor of truth. David Okoro, standing tall beside her, started toward the exit. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if compelled by a force greater than decorum, he turned back and spoke softly, but with the weight of history behind every word. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady and calm, "one day you'll realize the people you look down on are the very ones holding this country up." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a prophecy, and a truth too long ignored. A quiet murmur swelled into applause, gentle but full of meaning. It wasn't the wild cheering of victory, it was something deeper, a respectful recognition of justice restored, a tribute to resilience, a silent honor to the truth that had won. The spectators, the jurors, even some of the court staff, clapped softly, their eyes bright with newfound respect. Amara felt it too, an invisible tide lifting her, buoying her spirit above years of pain and humiliation. Outside, the sunlight struck her face like a warm blessing. For the first time in months, she breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the world ease from her chest. Her apron, stained with sweat and soap from a lifetime of service, still clung to her, but now it felt different, not a mark of shame or burden, but a kind of armor, proof of battles fought and survived. The scent of soap was no longer a reminder of servitude, but a badge of honor. Her father's eyes softened, a proud smile touching his lips as he looked at her. "You don't need their approval, Amara," he said quietly, voice full of hard-earned wisdom. "You just needed to remember who you are." The strength in his words wrapped around her like a shield. She nodded, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes, shining like quiet victories. "I do now," she whispered back, her voice steady and sure. Together they walked down the courthouse steps. The crowd around them shifted, the energy changing like a tide coming in. Reporters, who had once ignored her presence as if she were invisible, now jostled and called after her, desperate for a word, a statement, a story. But Amara didn't stop. She didn't turn her head toward the flashing cameras or the hungry questions. Instead, she kept her gaze forward, the cool wind brushing through her hair, carrying away the weight of old fears. Her voice, soft but clear, barely a whisper, carried a power stronger than any headline. "Dignity isn't given," she said, "it's kept." Those words, simple, true, hung in the air, settling deep into the hearts of those who heard. In a world obsessed with wealth and power, where status often seemed like the only currency, Amara's quiet strength spoke louder than any scream. The greatest victory she knew now was not just winning in a courtroom, but walking away still whole, still human. The crowd watched as she and her father disappeared into the streets, a small but fierce light shining between them. The cameras blinked off, the whispers faded, the judgment and sneers fell silent, and though the fight was far from over, because injustice rarely yields without a fight, this moment was theirs, a moment of redemption, a reclaiming of self. And here lies the truth for all of us: never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes it's the quiet ones who bring justice to its knees. Sometimes the strongest voices are not the loudest, but the ones that refuse to be broken. Amara's story is not just hers alone. It's the story of countless others who rise day after day against odds stacked high like mountains. Her victory is a beacon, a reminder that dignity, respect, and humanity cannot be stolen. They must be guarded fiercely. The sun dipped lower as they walked away, shadows growing longer but never swallowing their light. Justice, finally, had found its voice, and it spoke softly through a maid's quiet dignity and a daughter's unyielding pride.